Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to call on Dean Ryan Crocker first.
Well, thank you, Professor Scowcroft. Good morning to all of you. We could not have a more timely panel at a more appropriate time as we assess the nature not just of Alexander Putin, but Putin's Russia, and where Russia is in the world and where Russia is going or thinks it's going. Since the end of the Cold War, it has not been a unipolar world. We might have liked to think so. It's been multipolar or nonpolar. And we see this everywhere. You know, whether it's the Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, you name it. We have a very, very distinguished set of panelists who are going to try and break that down for us in the Russian paradigm. You know, I do hope you pay attention to it. It is going to define the world you live in for generations to come. And you will be looking at what role the U.S. needs to play. My own view is this is not Tyrannosaurus Rex. You know, it's not the new set of czars. It's not Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. You know, it's not the Kremlin of the communists, but it is Russia, and Russia counts. So again, I thank all of our panelists for coming today. We've got some of the best minds on Russia and Russia in the U.S. And I look forward very much to seeing the outcome of this and where it might guide us. You know, I thank you, Professor Scowcroft. I can't believe I did that. That just shows you what I think of you. Professor Natsios, who heads the Scowcroft Institute, we are a policy school. We are founded in academics, but we are policy relevant, and nothing could better show that today than what we are here to discuss. So, again, you know, thank you, Andrew. Thank all of you on the panels, and I look forward to a very, very productive and policy relevant outcome. And should you have trouble getting to a policy relevant outcome, Professor Natsios will guide you there.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Let me just make a couple of comments. I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute, and we had a meeting actually last fall, a year ago, with our advisory board of people outside the Institute, outside of the Bush School, and the professors within the Bush School, and we presented the idea of a conference on the 25th anniversary of the coming down of the Berlin Wall and the liberation of Eastern Europe, and then also a conference on where Russia was going. And the events earlier this year, the annexation by Russia of the Crimea, and then the civil conflict that's going on in eastern Ukraine with Russian troops, excuse me, not Soviet troops, Russian troops, which is ongoing now, led to the notion of this conference, which will lead to a book. We expect to take the papers from this conference and several other papers of people who are not able to attend and publish a book on reassessing Putin's Russia. I think Russia specialists have known that Russia has been moving away from the Yeltsin-era attempt to merge with the West and Europe in terms of democratic capitalism toward a different model. And some people had predicted we would return to great power rivalry, but for some people who have not been following this, that has been somewhat of a surprise, at least the aggressiveness with which this is happening. There is a risk, I think, if depending on how Putin sees the world, and we're going to hear, I think, some discussion today about what that worldview may be, toward a potential conflict. We don't know what his intentions are exactly, and we don't know where things are going to go, and the purpose of this conference is to assess those issues. So thank you for coming. We have a distinguished panel. Greg, if you'd like to take over.
Thanks, Andrew. Howdy. That's the way we start things at Texas A&M. I'm Gregory Gause. I'm the head of the International Affairs Department here at the Bush School, and it's been kind of a descent, hasn't it? We've gone from Ambassador Crocker, one of America's most distinguished diplomats, to Professor Natsios, with a distinguished career in both international affairs and domestic issues, and now you get to me, just an academic. But trust me, this is the low point of the day, because as you'll see when I introduce our three speakers today, we're going back up the ladder. We're going to have each speaker speak for about 30 minutes, as he would like, and then we're going to take a brief break to stretch our legs, and then come back for a facilitated period of questions and answers in which we ask you in the audience to participate with your comments and questions for the speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt, who is a political economist and demographer by training. He holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. In addition to his role at AEI, Dr. Eberstadt serves as a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research. He's a member of the Visiting Committee of the Harvard School of Public Health, and he's a member of the Global Leadership Council at the World Economic Forum. He researches and writes extensively on economic development, foreign aid, global health, demographics, and poverty. He's the author of numerous monographs and articles on North and South Korea, East Asia, and the countries of the former Soviet Union. His books range from The End of North Korea, published by AEI Press in 1999, to The Poverty of the Poverty Rate, also from AEI Press in 2008. He earned a master's degree from the London School of Economics and a Master of Public Administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and a doctorate in Political Economy and Government from Harvard University. Dr. Eberstadt, very happy to have you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gause. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here. Professor Natsios, thank you for inviting me. I want to be able to look at, oh, my homework is there, so I can actually look at it also. I think if we read the newspapers today, we hear a lot about how the Russian Federation is a rising power. And certainly it's a state that's acting more assertively and more aggressively on the international stage. But if you are trained the way I'm trained, which is in demographics and examining human resources, you come to the table with a very different impression. I'm not a demography is destiny boy, but I do believe that demographic trends matter, and that human resources matter, and that changes in demographic trends and in human resource profiles slowly but fairly unforgivingly alter the realm of the possible. And when you take a closer look at the Russian Federation's human fundamentals, one is struck by both the level of crisis, not a word that I use promiscuously, the level of crisis that one sees in various dimensions of Russia's human resource profile, and also the fundamentally pessimistic direction in which things are heading. So if you look at things from this human standpoint, you have to wonder whether Russia and the Russian Federation is not, in fact, a waning power rather than a rising power. And I'm going to go through my homework. I don't think I'm going to take 30 minutes, but I'm going to show you a bunch of slides which outline the reasons that I think this. They all have sources on them. All of this stuff is replicable. It's not Nick's magic. You can go to the sources and see how I got all this stuff, and you can disagree with my interpretation, but we can all start from the same hymn book, if you see what I mean. Okay, so from the Kremlin's standpoint, one of the few positive aspects of Russia's demographic situation in recent years has been the decline in depopulation. For almost 20 years, from the collapse of Soviet communism until late in the previous decade, Russia's population was in decline, maybe not quite freefall, but in very stark decline. That decline has stabilized for the time being. There's actually a slight increase in Russia's population over the past few years. I will tell you in a few minutes why I think this is only going to be a temporary pause in the continuing depopulation, but this is one of the trends that the Kremlin sees as being a happy one, and the Kremlin would like to take credit for having reversed the depopulation. The reason that Russia was having a big depopulation, which has at least temporarily halted, is because after the end of the Soviet period, there was a collapse in birth totals and an upsurge in death totals, so that for many years, deaths were exceeding births by almost 1 million per year. Which in a country of 140 million people is not small change. As you can see, the surfeit of deaths over births has kind of ended, at least temporarily. Last year, actually, there were a few more births recorded than deaths. But during this period of excess deaths over births, which lasted for about 20 years, there were about almost 3 deaths for every 2 births for 2 decades in the Russian Federation. Now, if you were a demographer and all you knew about a country was it was cranking out 3 deaths for every 2 births, you didn't know anything else about it, you'd say, well, maybe it's got an unending deadly epidemic, maybe it's got a famine that it can't stop, maybe it's in the middle of a total war, a kind of a 30 years war sort of thing. You wouldn't think that it was a modern, educated, literate, urbanized society during peacetime. It's a very unusual thing to have happen. If you look at what occurred over this 20-year period, Russia's deaths exceeded its births by almost 14 million count during this 20-year period. If you want to find a time when some country experienced a greater surfeit of deaths over births, you have to go back to Maoist China in the early 1960s, in the aftermath of the catastrophic Great Leap Forward, the Maoist created famine then. Nothing on this order has been seen in the post-war period apart from that Chinese catastrophe. One of the reasons that births and deaths have come back almost more or less into balance, at least for the time being in Russia, is that there has been an increase, rebound in the birth rate, in childbearing patterns. What I show in this graphic is what demographers call net reproduction rates, which is to say, for a society to continue at a level of stability, You need to have one daughter born per woman who reaches childbearing age. So 1.0 is stability. If you're above that, you're growing. If you're below that, you're going to be shrinking from generation to generation if you don't have compensating immigration coming in. So you can see there that after the collapse of Soviet socialism, birth levels in Russia got real low. By the late 1990s, they were on a pace which would have implied a shrinking from generation to generation of almost 50%. There's been a rebound since then, but despite this rebound, Russia's fertility level is still below replacement. Even with this rebound, if patterns continued the way they are now, each generation in Russia would be shrinking by about 20% without additional immigration. Okay. Now, this is a national average here. Of course, Russia is a territory with enormous ethnic, linguistic, cultural, historical, internal diversity. When you break down birth levels by smaller territories, by provinces or oblasts or republics or whatever you want to call them, you get a little bit of a more nuanced pattern. You find that there are a few places within the Russian territory that actually are at or above replacement level. All of those places, however, are either territories in which there is a very sizable non-Russian ethnic indigenous ethnicity, or else they're places with a historical, cultural tradition from Islam, Muslim populations. I make no claim as to how Muslim they are today, but from a historical standpoint. And so, so you have some places in the Russian Federation, like let's say Chechnya, where birth levels are kind of like the way they are in Utah in the United States today. And then you've got other places like Moscow where birth levels are about 40% below what would be needed for sustaining population over the long haul. Generally speaking, the more Russian ethnic a place is, the lower its fertility level is within this kind of tapestry that I'm showing you there. One final thing about family and births. If you put Russia on a European map, from the birth and family standpoint, it looks like a pretty European place. It's got a sub-replacement birth level. It has a appreciable proportion of children born outside of marriage. Russia looks like what demographers call a second demographic transition country, which is to say a place that's kind of set for more or less long-term below replacement fertility and increasingly contingent marital or cohabitation arrangements. This part looks pretty European. And that's the last thing that I'm going to show you that looks pretty European. Because now we're going to get into health and education and human services and things like that. And this is a different story. The rest of this is going to be kind of like a nightmare story, kind of like a Halloween story. So if you look only at Russia's educational levels, its human capital story looks fantastic. That little red dot on there is Russia. The proportion of adults who have tertiary degrees, it's better than Scandinavia, it's better than Germany, it's better than Holland in terms of diplomas. Diplomas are just one thing, but if you look at the number of years of schooling that Russian adults have, that completed schooling, Russia's years of completed schooling appear to be superior to places like Denmark or to France. So you would think that all sorts of good things would be happening with health and with knowledge production and stuff like that. So here we go to the nightmare on Kremlin Street. Russia has been, the Russian Federation has been unable to raise its level of life expectancy at birth above the level achieved half a century ago. It's one of the very few places in the world where health levels are less favorable by this critical measure today than they were half a century ago. Because not to put too fine a point on it, we live in a world that's bursting with health. All around the world, health levels are improving. There are a few exceptions, such as places where HIV/AIDS is ravaging populations in southern Africa, but they are exceptions. And Russia is the most staggering exception of them all. Because, as I say, it's not just a literate, urbanized society, it's a society which appears to have a higher educational profile than France or Denmark. So it's hard to do that when you're seemingly that educated. Break it down a little bit further. Look at the death rates per 100,000 population. This is an apples and apples comparison. There's something called age standardized death rates. So you've got a common age profile and put age-specific death rates against it. That's so you don't end up making the mistake of thinking that Florida is way sicker than Utah because Florida has an older population and Utah is a more youthful one. You want to be able to compare similar things. So Russia, when I grow up, I want to live in a country that has a stable but declining death rate, right? Because that's like good for a society, to be stable but kind of declining. Russia's the red line there. And Russia's death rates have veered erratically, horrifyingly, over the post-communist period. They're going down at the moment, and that's good. Death rates going down is like a good thing. However, they are over twice as high in this age-standardized way as the death rates for Western European states. And eerily, they're about 50% higher than for what are called the new EU states, which are almost all former Soviet bloc territories, even though they were the same right before the end of communism. It's not easy to do this, but it's possible. So why is Russia's death situation so horrifyingly high? When you break it down by causes of death, you see it's almost all due to two causes. Cardiovascular disease, which is heart attack, stroke, things like that, and injuries, what's called external causes, which is murder, suicide, traffic accidents, hitting your head on the curb, those sorts of things. When you look at Russia's death rate from heart disease, it is higher than any other country in the world. And it is about 4 times as high as a country with that then would be predicted for a country with its income level. 4 times as high as would be predicted for a country with its income level. The highest that cardiovascular death levels ever got for a Western country was in Finland in '71. Russia's 50% higher than that. It's a pioneer, if you want to call it that. It's been coming down lately, but this is what happens, this is what it looks like after it's coming down. Then there's injuries. You look at the neighborhood that Russia's in on this graph. Yes, Iraq, there are some other post-conflict or conflict societies that are up there. Russia, as I said, is a society ostensibly at peace. Russia's death level from injuries is about 5 times as high as you'd predict for a country of its income level. It's so high. Men are always more violent than women in big populations, right? But Russia's achieved a crossover. The death levels from injury for women are higher in Russia than in any country for men in Western Europe, to give you an idea of where we're at, okay? And, it's like the QVC channel. There's more. It just kind of goes on forever. I've got a little chart here where I show the life expectancy of life expectancy at age 15 of what are called least developed countries. This is a UN classification for the poorest countries in the world. And this is for guys at age 15. And I put Russia in, which is the little red graphic. Russia's life expectancy at age 15 is 3 years lower than for their counterparts in Haiti. Russian life expectancy for men at age 15. So it's not fair to say that Russia's got a third world life span, because that would be unfair to third world countries, right? And it's not just, I mean, the situation for guys is vastly worse than for girls. But even if you look at the female population in Russia, they still fit on the least developed country map of adult health. And this is women, okay? Who play nicer than guys. Okay. So either way, it's it's a pretty dismal situation. And I think I've just got one more here. So if you look at survival curves, and that stuff, by the way, was not from Nick. That was all from the World Health Organization, from a very reputable source. And this is also from the World Health Organization. When you look at survival curves for guys, and I think, which I did, Russia is blue, Africa is red. It's essentially indistinguishable now, the survival curve for men. And I don't know how many of you, I do this public health stuff. So many times I go to Russia and I get the lecture that Russia is not Africa. I'll bring along this slide next time. So that's the health calamity. And now the other part of the calamity is in knowledge production. You saw what an ostensibly educated population the Russian Federation's adult men and women would seem to be. Look at what's coming out in terms of patents, okay? Start with the US Patent and Trade Office. I mean, admittedly, we're Americans, and so we're biased permanently against Russia and all of that, but look at it anyhow. Russia has 2% of the world's population, 6% of the world's college-educated adults, and it's turning out less than 1/3% of the patents generated by the US Patent and Trade Office, okay? And if you want to break it down by state, Russia's annual level of patent awards it's ahead of West Virginia. I mean, West Virginia is wild and wonderful, but it is not known as a knowledge center in the United States. It's a little bit behind Alabama. It's about 1/15 of what is being generated every year in Texas. And Texas is the second largest population of states in the United States, but it's still like 1/6 as big as Russia. So we've got a kind of a scale problem here. Okay, I said no. The U.S. Patent and Trade Office may be, prejudiced permanently and structurally against Russia. Of course, it gives the U.S. a home field advantage. But let's look instead at international stuff, at the World Intellectual Property Office. There are international patent applications outside of the United States, just countries applying for patents outside of their home field advantage. Russia looks a little bit better. But here again, you've got an order of magnitude problem. 6% of the world's college-educated adults, 0.5% of the world's patent applications. There's something wrong with this picture. And if you try to do this in terms of patents per university grad, it looks even more terrifying. The little red thing all the way off on the side is Russia. So they're a little bit above Gabon, but they're behind 46 other countries. It's a very, very, very poor showing. And if you, like I, know lots of people from Russia, you know they're really smart, really talented people in that society, really smart. To end up with this sort of performance speaks to something that's institutionally, catastrophically bad in that society. It's like the old Soviet factories with huge amounts of resources going in and nothing coming out. Okay, the next side on this is looking at international exports of services. Anybody who's got a lot of oil in the ground and a lot of gas in the ground can export gas and oil. You just need to ask BP or ExxonMobil to help you. Your own services, exporting your own services is a metric of human capital. And look at where Russia is on this list of the top 20. Russia's 21. Take away a few of the things in which heavy machinery and slightly militarized things may give you some advantages. Russia looks even more poor in that respect. And take a look at IT and computer exports. Okay, that's something in which I would think the Russian Federation would have a big advantage. Well, they do. They've got a big advantage over the Philippines, but that's about it. Okay. So that is the nightmare of human resources today in Russia. And I think there are reasons to imagine that this is going to get worse, not better, in the generation immediately ahead. So this is the, let's not use the Census Bureau because they're Americans and Americans are prejudiced against Russia and so forth. Let's leave the Census Bureau out. Let's look at the UN Population Division where they've got good Russian demographers, among others. The UN is projecting on all of its assumptions, high, medium, and low, that Russia is going to resume depopulation. Well, just because they say that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It depends upon assumptions. But when you look at Goskomstat, when you look at the Russian Federal Statistical Agency, they too, so near to the Kremlin, they too are assuming that Russia is going to head back into a net mortality mode in the immediate future or the not so distant future. Why do they assume that? Because there was a birth slump for babies in the 90s. Those babies are becoming the childbearing women, like Nowsville, and there are a lot less of them. And Russia is an aging society, so that all other things being equal, death rates will increase. There's an enormous pressure for Russia to resume depopulation. It's what depopulation looks like with Russian characteristics, we think. At least a projection. The implications for the military you can see from here. Just two more things I'll show you. Russia's proportion of working age population is on the decline because the world is a moving target, right? So you can see that Russia's proportion of working age population is on the decline, but it looks even worse if you look at Russia's proportion of trained, high school or better trained working population. It's already declined substantially and is set to decline even more. Most dramatically, Russia was an education superpower at the end of the Cold War. 9% of the world's college-educated working age people were in Russian Federation alone. We're right down now to about 4.5%, heading to 3% by 2030. And to add to that, Russia's life expectancy is now about the same, the male and female together, as for the UN's category of less developed regions, less developed countries. Doesn't mean that the UN demographers are right about this, but the UN demographers are projecting that Russia's health level will be lower than that of the third world as a whole by 2030. Put all of this together, and you're talking about a society whose economic potential is constrained and in relation to the rest of the world seems to be shrinking. There is enormous pressure on Russia to be a less powerful economic actor in 10 or 15 years than it is today, and that has to affect its capabilities on the world stage. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we can call it quits now. Thanks for coming. During questions, I'm looking forward to hearing about why people, including you, Dr. Eberstadt, think that this enormous decline has happened and playing out its consequences. Our next speaker is Mr. David Satter, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He also teaches Russian politics at SAIS. A Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times from 1976 to 1982, Mr. Satter has written 3 books on Russia. The most recent was It Was a Long Time Ago and It Never Happened Anyway, Russia and the Communist Past, which was published in 2011. He's also the author of Age of Delirium, The Decline and Fall of the Soviet Union, published in 1996, which is the basis for a documentary which just came out a couple of years ago, premiered in Washington in late 2011 and in Moscow in the winter of 2012. He's also the author of Darkness at Dawn, The Rise of the Russian Criminal State, which was published in 2008, I think, right?
2003.
2003, sorry about that. Should have written that one down. He's a frequent contributor to publications like the Wall Street Journal, National Review Online. He's been interviewed by numerous media outlets for his expertise on Russia. And very interestingly, in December of 2013, he was barred from returning to Russia, earning the dubious distinction of being the first American journalist banned from Russia since the end of the Cold War. Mr. Satter.
Oh, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for coming. Hope that, there we are. Okay. The picture that that Nick Eberstadt has painted so graphically with the help of statistics is really a reflection of the events, the human events that have taken place over the last 23 years. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we may find it difficult to remember now, but in fact there was tremendous hope surrounding Russia. It was thought that Russia would become a strategic partner of the United States, that it would join the ranks of developed countries and democratic countries, that its influence in the world would grow, that it would be a factor for peace, that its long-suffering citizens would clearly and for the first time experience a rebirth of democracy and freedom, and that the beneficiaries of that would be the whole world. Of course, as we now know, it didn't turn out that way. Russia has become the first country to violate the post-war understanding that borders cannot be changed by force. In its seizure of the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, a country with which it had roughly 250 treaties, all of which directly or indirectly affirmed the territorial integrity of Ukraine, it took a step which only Saddam Hussein dared to take when he invaded Kuwait, and as we know, that ended with him being expelled from Kuwait by force, and the territorial integrity of Kuwait being restored. What is it that led to this very sad development for an extremely gifted and cultured people who have contributed, in fact, a great deal to the world? In essence, it was the misconception that it's possible to change an economic system without the benefit of the rule of law. The idea that, in fact, it's the economic system and the way in which property is organized and managed that determines whether or not people will be really free and whether they'll be able to lead an ethical and a decent existence. Adam Smith, in his classic works on capitalist economics, developed the following definition for a free market. He said, free market consists of equivalent exchange. I give you something, and I get from you the equivalent in value. Of course, I don't get necessarily the same thing. And in fact, what I get from you may be very different from what you gave me. The point is that according to value as established by the market, the exchange is a fair one. It's an equal one. But then how is it possible to determine what's fair if you're exchanging, for example, buffaloes for automobiles or something like that? It requires a framework of law. So implicit in Adam Smith's definition was the notion that law and regulation and a society's ethical standards establish the context for their economic relations. What happened in Russia was that this very basic truth was not understood. And it was not understood in part, I must add, because the Russians were badly advised. Now, the Russians are adults, they make their own decisions, but nonetheless, a lot of the bad advice came from us. There was having lived for generations in a free society in which rule of law is very firmly rooted, many American academics and economists neglected to take account of the fact that free market operations in a functioning market economy and in a democratic society take place within the framework of law. And they were dealing in Russia with a country in which the understanding of law, the understanding of ethics had been destroyed by 70-plus years of spiritual sterilization under communism, and a tradition for centuries before that of treating the individual as simply raw material for the use of the state. Under these circumstances, radical economic solutions, which did not take into account the need of creating a structure of law, but concentrated exclusively on transforming an economy that was based on state ownership into an economy in which all property was in private hands, or most property was in private hands, took place on the assumption that that transformation could be treated as a goal in itself. Well, the irony of the situation is that that kind of thinking, although theoretically radical in its capitalist, pro-capitalist, and pro-market assumptions, was in fact a mirror image of the philosophy and procedures that existed under communism. Because one of the most important fundamental theoretical principles in communism is that the economy determines everything, that law, ethics, culture are only the superstructure of a society, whereas the bases of the society are economic. In other words, what happened in 1991, 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when everything that we saw, that we have seen since, was prepared for, and when, by the way, the demographic situation, that the catastrophic demographic situation that Nick has described was not as bad as it became, all of that was based on the notion that it was important to take property out of the hands of the state and to do it rapidly, to do it regardless of law, to do it without an ethical or moral context, and to make sure, and to do it without any regard as to who was receiving the property. Didn't matter whether the people who received the property were gangsters. It didn't matter whether they used criminal methods. Important thing was that the property would end up in private hands. And the assumption was, by the Russian young reformers and by the Americans, who oftentimes, by many of the Americans, not all, I'm happy to say, who mistakenly advised them, including people in our own government, that the market would sort everything out. It didn't really matter if the people who were gaining the property were criminals, or whether they acquired it through dishonest means, because the market would separate out the efficient owners from the inefficient owners, and the efficient owners would prevail. Now, was only one problem with that calculation, and it was a problem to which people were surprisingly blind. It was that it assumed the existence of a law-based state. Yes, it is true that under conditions of effective administration of the law, such a tendency exists. But in Russia, once property was put in criminal hands, it really didn't matter whether the criminals used the property efficiently. They hadn't the slightest intention of giving it up. And as a result, the process that took place in Russia was a process of rapid and far-reaching criminalization. We didn't see, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the emergence of a creative and dynamic entrepreneurial class. There was no need for that. Under the circumstances, what mattered was to have corrupt connections to government officials who, in return for bribes, could create opportunities that immediately produced millions, and in some cases billions, of dollars. I can give you a couple of examples. In the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, there was an enormous difference between the domestic price of oil and the world market price. In fact, there were times when the domestic internal price of oil in Russia was literally 1% of the cost of oil on the world market. Well, under the Soviet system, the export of oil and the export of other commodities was controlled by foreign trade organizations, and the profits from those deals were deposited in the state treasury. Once the foreign trade organizations were disbanded after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was possible for private persons to export oil. But how were those private persons to be selected? Well, insofar as the people who controlled the selection process were government officials who were impoverished, and whose decision nonetheless made possible the instant accumulation of huge amounts of money. Of course, it was done on the basis of connections and bribes. The early oil traders, and many of them then became Russia's leading oligarchs, were able to buy oil at 1%, sell it at the world market prices, and reap the windfall profits, much of which was never returned to Russia, but in fact deposited in offshore bank accounts out of fear that it was not safe in Russia. The result, what happened in the case of oil happened in numerous other situations. For example, people who began to accumulate wealth established their own commercial banks. Those commercial banks then became empowered by the government to handle government accounts. For example, the accounts of the government customs service, which were placed with the Onexim Bank, run by Vladimir Potanin, one of the early oligarchs. Those accounts were worth billions of dollars. And instead of using the money as it was intended to pay employees, to pay the expenses of the ministry, to provide money, tax money in the final analysis to the government treasury, the empowered banks kept the money, did not pay the salaries, and used it to speculate with the government's money. They may eventually have turned it over, but non-payment of salaries became so widespread in Russia, in part because empowered banks receiving government funds didn't use the money to pay salaries, but used it for speculation. We could go on with the illegal and unethical ways in which the country was pillaged and a few people became fabulously rich. But not only was the economy devastated, Russia suffered during the 1990s a 44% drop in the gross national product. We can compare that with the Great Depression in the United States, when the drop was 25%, or the Depression in Germany, where it was 16%, which was enough, by the way, to help bring the Nazis to power. During that time, as we've already heard from Nick, there was a catastrophic rise in the death rate. The reason being that people deprived of salaries, forced to grow their own food in many cases, and deprived of any sense that their life had meaning, simply gave up on their own health, and they gave up on their own futures. It was a common thing in Russia for a person to become sick and out of sheer despair to make no effort to save his own life, convinced, first of all, that the underfunded hospitals and medical service would not care for him, and second of all, that his life didn't amount to anything anyway, since he had devoted his entire life to communism. Communism was now discredited, and the country was instead being run by gangsters. This situation led to a quiet revolt on the part of the population. It was not that people took to the streets. They didn't. Many of them felt too helpless to do that. But the deep bitterness took root. And Yeltsin became one of the most, who was the president and who was reelected in 1996, became one of the most hated and disliked Russian leaders ever. In 1999, at the time when his second term in office was coming to an end, opinion polls showed that he was supported by 2% of the population. Now, sociologists will tell you that in any poll, 6% of the respondents don't understand the question. So if 2% are supporting Yeltsin, it raised serious doubt as to whether anyone in Russia actually supported him. And what was true of Yeltsin was true also of his hand-picked successor, Vladimir Putin. First of all, no one had ever heard of Putin. He had never run for office. He was totally uncharismatic. His entire previous career had been really as an assistant, almost his entire previous career, the most important part of his previous career, as an assistant to the mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. He was brought out of nowhere to become the new prime minister and Yeltsin's chosen successor. Yet it was highly unlikely that he could have won any election, or that anyone who had Yeltsin's support could have won an election against the background of the criminal chaos that had existed in Russia during the 1990s. Many people at that time had not received their salaries for months and even years. It was common practice in those days for people to try to survive by the help, with the help of private plots outside the city, which were handed out by the government, which was in effect telling people, well, we understand you're not being paid, but we'll give you the opportunity to grow your own food. And that's exactly what people did. The trains leaving the major cities on the weekends, the suburban electric trains, were full of people with agricultural implements, bags, products going out to their rural plots in order to raise the food that they would need for the winter. I mean, under those conditions, what kind of popularity could Yeltsin reasonably hope for? Obviously not much. And there was a growing dread among those who were close to Yeltsin that not only would power change hands, but they would be held criminally responsible for the depredations and the pillaging of the country. And for an outside observer, and I was one of them, it seemed to me inevitable that there would be a grand settling of accounts. And there might even be a revision of the privatization process, according to which the nation's factories, enterprises were, in many cases, handed over for a song to well-connected and corrupt insiders. But in September 1999, explosions began to take place in apartment buildings in Moscow and in 2 other cities. The bombings were blamed on Chechen terrorists, although there was no evidence at all the Chechens had anything to do with them. And Vladimir Putin was put in charge of a new enterprise, a second war in Chechnya, under circumstances in which he could pose as the defender of the Russian people who had been viciously attacked in their own homes as they slept by terrorists. The war was more brutal and more indiscriminate than the first Chechen war. It included bombing of civilian population centers, attacks on refugee columns, attacks on civilian areas with ground-to-ground missiles, tactics that had not been used in some cases during the first Chechen war. But as a result of it, Putin's popularity rose, and he was identified not with the corrupt pillaging of the country in the 1990s, but on the contrary, with the defense of the Russian people against a treacherous terrorist attack, and he was elected the new president of Russia. There was only one problem, and that was a 5th bomb was discovered in the basement of an apartment building in the town of Ryazan, and the people who put the bomb in the basement were actually captured, and they turned out not to be Chechen terrorists, they turned out to be agents of the FSB, the security police. This was covered up. The FSB announced that this was a training exercise. The bomb wasn't real, it was a test of vigilance, but they confiscated the bomb, and they took custody of the bombers, and all of that evidence was declared secret, even though that's a violation of the Russian Constitution. In the years that followed, the new FSB, KGB leadership of Russia took steps to restrict those democratic liberties, or what was left of the democratic liberties that had been tolerated by Yeltsin in the 90s. First, the press was subjected to control, especially the national television stations. Then the business community was brought under control on the basis of the examples of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was arrested on charges of fraud and tax evasion and sentenced to 10 years in prison, although fraud and tax evasion was the way in which all of the leading businessmen made their fortunes during the 1990s. After that, not a single holder of great wealth in Russia was ready to challenge the authorities. The elimination of the direct election of governors, in general, the reform of the election system, which created for which provided for the domination of the parliament by a few parties that could be controlled and which had very little tie to their own localities. And finally, the handing out of spoils to those at the top, so that the process of corruption reached, which had been fantastic under Yeltsin, reached a level under Putin that was even beyond fantastic, and fueled as it was by an exceptional rise in the world price of raw materials, including oil and gas, which benefited Russia enormously and contributed to the country's increase in prosperity during that period as well. But in 2011, after Dmitry Medvedev had replaced Putin as president but remained under Putin's control, it was announced that Putin was coming back for a third term as president. The only thing that Medvedev had done during the period from 2008 to 2012, when he sat in as president, was to extend the term of the president from 4 to 6 years, so that Putin had the possibility of 12 more years in office, beginning in 2012. And this, plus the evident corruption of parliamentary elections in December 2011, inspired the first protests against Putin's rule. And they were serious protests. They attracted up to 100,000 people, the biggest demonstrations seen in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. But they eventually fizzled out. And it was only once they had done so that massive protests broke out in neighboring Ukraine. And those protests, strange as it seems, were actually decisive for Russia, because the Russian leadership witnessed that a population was capable of organizing itself against corruption, against mismanagement, and against abuse of power, and driving from office a small clique of predators, very similar to the clique of predators that rule in Russia. The future now is likely to be filled with real problems for the world community and real problems for the Russian people and for the Ukrainians. Because this tactic is unlikely to work in the long run, despite the short-term boost in popularity that it's given to the Putin regime. And the consequences of it cannot be controlled, because the world as a whole will react and is reacting to the acts of regression that have been undertaken in order to protect those who are ruling in Russia, and who owe their power to the whole corrupt process that took place during these 20 years. We now have a terrible problem in the world with the spread of Islamic fanaticism in Iraq and Syria, and the danger that the Islamic State movement poses. But there's also a danger of the possibilities that exist for Russia, because a regime of this kind is slowly running down because of its exhaustion of its human resources, its general inefficiency, and its readiness to use aggressivity, which will be answered with aggressivity. Russia is the world's second nuclear power, so therefore we need only to hope that steps can be taken to reverse this process, which began long ago, and that can only be stopped with respect for the rule of law and a kind of moral revolution in Russia to accompany the economic revolution that took place. That's the most we can hope for Russia today, and it's what, in fact, the long-suffering Russian people, under the burden of bad government and bad advice, truly deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker this morning is Professor Roger Reese of Texas A&M. By all means. He received his PhD from the University of Texas, but we don't hold that against him, in 1990, and joined the Texas A&M History Department that same year. Professor Reese specializes in Soviet social history in general and in the social history of the Soviet military in particular. He's written 3 books on the Soviet military and won the Mankato Prize for from the Society for Military History for the outstanding article in military history of that year. His current research focuses on the Russian officer corps in the late imperial period and in the First World War and the Revolutionary period in particular. Professor Reese.
Thank you. The title of my portion here is The Legacy of World War II for Putin's Russia. In 2012, historian Roger Markwick wrote, quote, "The Second World War has never ended for the citizens of the former Soviet Union," end quote. He claims that despite the challenges to the legacy from outside Russia, quote, "it continues to strike a real resonance with the individual life and death experiences and memories of millions of former Soviet citizens," end quote. I argue the opposite, that today the war has little to no meaning for the vast majority of the Russian population. It lost most of its utility for the government with the demise of communism and the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the rest has gone by the way with the birth of a generation that has never known communism or experienced the Soviet Union. Thus, it follows that Putin's attempt to use the legacy of the war to rally a rather fragmented Russian people behind his policies in the name of patriotism and to substitute for a lack of vision is a waste of time and a failed use of history for political purposes. What do we mean by legacy, and why is it worth talking about 69 years after the end of World War II? The dictionary located in the dock of my computer gives 2 definitions of legacy. The first is a noun, quote, "a thing handed down by a predecessor," end quote. The second, in the jargon of the computer world, is an adjective denoting software or hardware that has been superseded but is difficult to replace because of its wide use. Both of these definitions have meaning when we analyze the legacy of the Second World War for Putin's Russia. Following the disintegration of the USSR, some things handed down from the war have disappeared. Foremost among them are great power status and the political and economic domination of Eastern Europe. Other things, such as collective trauma and an acute gender imbalance of the war generation, have mercifully passed or have significantly diminished. What remains is a landscape cluttered with thousands of monuments to the war scattered across the former USSR and Eastern Europe, the dwindling remnants of the war generation who feel entitled to public subsidies and are simultaneously idealized and neglected by the state, expatriate communities of Russians in all the former Soviet republics, and a contest over what meaning should be taken from the war as it applies to contemporary society, politics, and diplomacy. It is this contest over the meaning of the war that fits the computerese adjective of legacy, software or hardware that has been superseded but is difficult to replace because of its wide use. Before the disintegration of the USSR, the meaning of the war passed through several distinct interpretive phases depending on who was in power in the Kremlin. Despite their variations, each phase included the basic ideas that the USSR bore the greatest burden of defeating Hitler's Germany in cost of lives and destruction of property, and that because the USSR liberated Eastern Europe from fascism, it was therefore entitled to dominate it as a bloc. It was understood that the victory validated the rule of the Communist Party and the Soviet social system despite their failures, and until his death, the rule of Stalin. Leonid Brezhnev first used the legacy of the war to justify his regime despite its failures, which led to cynicism and finally to its critical re-evaluation under Gorbachev. Like his Soviet predecessors, Putin has taken an active role in pushing a reinterpretation of the legacy that supports his domestic political agenda and foreign policy. But, unlike the Soviet era, it has not gone uncontested. The state's version faces competing narratives and has served as a basis for attacks on his governance and foreign policy, and has created international tensions. The interpretation of the meaning and legacy of their so-called Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, which is what they call World War II, adopted by Putin and the political right in Russia, borrows from the original legacy that Russia, merely mentioning the USSR, bore the major share of the load in defeating Nazi Germany. Now, Russia has saved the world from fascism. Following from this, the world, but most specifically the European Union, the former states of the USSR, and the United States, should be more respectful of Russia, give it its due, and especially defer to its foreign policy agenda in the near abroad. At the present time, Putin is attempting to use the legacy of the war to justify to the international community and the Russian population attacks on the Ukraine by slapping the label fascist on it. It is apparent that the Putin government has an agenda regarding how it portrays the legacy of the war to the nation, now 3 generations past the great victory. It wants to use the war to promote patriotism and national pride in a Russia that has yet to produce contemporary heroes or heroic events. In doing so, Putin has been inconsistently taking credit for the victory from its previous association with Stalin and the Communist Party and assigning it to the Russian people. He is trying to use the memory of the war and its enormous sacrifice to build unity among the people on the basis of shared suffering. He wants to use the legacy of suffering to create distance between the Russian people and the West by portraying the EU, NATO, and the former Soviet satellite states and the former Soviet republics, particularly the Baltic states and Ukraine, as being ungrateful and perhaps even pro-fascist. So far, Putin's record on communicating this message is mixed. For the younger generations born since 1990, it is just stories of which many have grown tired. Although the history of the war is part of the national school curriculum, evidently students are not paying close attention to their lessons. On June 21st, 2002, the day before the celebration of the Day of Memory and Sorrow, which commemorates the German invasion in 1941, a public opinion poll was taken to see how many people knew the significance of the next day's date. Only 18% responded correctly. That's a big date. The invasion of Soviet Union by Nazi Germany, June 22nd, is all over the place all the time, and only 18% population knew that. In 2011, Moscow Humanitarian University published the results of a study it conducted about the feelings of Russian youth about the heroism of Soviet soldiers in the Great Patriotic War. 800 students from various universities across Russia were polled. Only 14% of the respondents correctly identified Joseph Stalin as the supreme commander of the Red Army during the war. When asked to name other prominent figures of the war, many students correctly thought of Hitler and Roosevelt, but nearly 37% of those surveyed could not give a single name at all. Nearly half of those surveyed could not think of a single hero, a Soviet hero of World War II. Despite their lack of factual knowledge, historical knowledge, 96% of those polled believed that they should be proud of Russia's role in the Great Patriotic War, whatever that was, and 82% believed it was necessary to continue to hold Victory Day parades. This support for Victory Day celebrations does not mean that people accord them reverence. Alcohol finally had to be banned from the St. Petersburg celebrations this year because the annual festivities have frequently turned into drunken melees during the fireworks. As for major battles or campaigns, a quarter of respondents claimed no knowledge of the battles of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk, which in the historical profession all debated as were those the turning points of the war or not. Just over half have heard of the siege of Leningrad, and 1/3 of students knew there had been a battle for Berlin. Fully 25% of the students polled equated the Great Patriotic War with the First World War and Napoleon's invasion in 1812 as being so far past as to be irrelevant to contemporary life. In sum, the survey shows that the Great Patriotic War is well on the way to becoming legendary rather than real to young people. It is far from clear that Putin understands or appreciates how the generation gap has affected the level of reverence for the war in contemporary society. Putin may be blinded by his own emotional attachment to the legacy of the war. His father served in the Red Army for the duration of the war, and his mother was a survivor of the siege of Leningrad. On January 1st this year, Putin led a procession of siege survivors in commemorating the siege of Leningrad to the Piskarevskoye Cemetery, where he laid a wreath in honor of his brother, who just recently, surprise, it was announced, was buried there. This is a huge cemetery, 600,000 people buried in this cemetery. It is likely that Putin was a replacement child for his deceased brother who died during the siege. There can be no doubt that the shadow of the war shaded his childhood. The gap between Putin's and his generation's attachment to the war and the meaning it gives to his and their sense of patriotism and that of Russia's younger generation is illustrated by the minor uproar caused by Russia's candidate for Miss Earth, 24-year-old Natalia Petroverzeva, crowned in November 2012, for her answer to the question of what made her proud of Russia. Here's her answer. My Russia is a beautiful and majestic lady, full-blooded, red-cheeked, wearing an embroidered sundress and a long, thick braid with multicolored ribbons in it. She is a fabulous girl. My Russia is a cow with huge eyes and funny horns that always chews something. Oh, and how sweet its milk is. But my Russia is also a poor, huge, and suffering country that has been ruthlessly torn by greedy, dishonest atheists. My Russia is a big artery from which a few people take away her wealth. My Russia is a beggar. My Russia cannot help the elderly and orphans. It is bleeding and sinking like a ship, and engineers, doctors, teachers escape from this ship because they have nothing to live on. My Russia is an endless war in the Caucasus. These embittered brotherly nations that previously spoke the same language, which is now forbidden to teach in schools. My Russia is the winner that destroyed fascism and bought the victory at the expense of millions of lives. This was not the expression of national pride that Putin and the conservative element in Russia wanted to hear. For all of Putin's use of the legacy of the war to promote patriotism, it does not seem to be showing positive results. In a Levada Center poll of 1,600 Russians conducted in February after the 2014 Winter Olympics, the number of people who agreed that a patriot should defend the country from any kind of insults and criticism has dropped from 24% in 2000 to 18% in 2014. However, over the same time period, the number of respondents who interpreted patriotism as the personal feeling of love for one's homeland increased from 58 to 68%. But most ominously for Putin was the disparity in numbers between those who did or did not agree with the statement that, quote, a patriot should support the authorities no matter what, end quote. 23.3% agreed, but 65.3% disagreed. How relevant the emotional legacy of the Great Patriotic War is for Russian patriotism today is impossible to quantify. But if willingness to serve in the armed forces is an indicator, then the war surely has become irrelevant to draft-age men. Draft evasion has been a problem since the disintegration of the USSR, and rates of evasion remain extremely high despite all efforts to promote patriotism and service. In 2012, the Defense Ministry estimated that 200,000 men had evaded the draft, and a further 244,000 in 2013. Veterans, as living legacy of the war, have proved to be both a blessing and a curse to the Putin administration in its artless attempts to glorify the war in the name of national pride. Only since Putin has been in power has the Russian government publicly held up veterans as living role models for Russia to promote pride and unity. Speaking in Volgograd in 2003, on the 60th anniversary of the conclusion of the Battle of Stalingrad, Putin said, quote, the experience of the unity that was demonstrated by the Great Patriotic War is especially valuable at present, when extremism and terrorism are rearing their heads in the world, end quote. 3 months later, in a speech on Victory Day, Putin said, May 9th will always remain a glorious historic date. It reminds us of the prowess of the fighters who defeated fascism and saved humanity from slavery. The glorious memory of the feat of arms and labor of our compatriots for the sake of freedom and the happiness of future generations is still fresh in the hearts of all people. I'm convinced that the power and unity that our peoples demonstrated during the war years will be a good example for future generations to follow, end quote. Newspapers regularly publish a plethora of interviews of veterans around all the milestone dates associated with the war or national holidays. During the rest of the year, however, there's virtually no mention of them. It is as though veterans cease to exist except on those dates. Unfortunately, both for the veterans and Putin, he has sworn to fulfill the promises of social support for the veterans that they never received under the Soviet regime. Yet he has been unable, or some argue, unwilling to come through just as the Soviets had been. In the process, he has validated the expectations of veterans, yet discredited his government in an environment of free speech where observant critics can point out that his actions do not correspond to his words. Even as he has raised their expectations, Putin tells veterans that their main reward for their suffering was the victory itself, and that whatever suffering they currently experience, it is minor compared to their war experiences, as if to minimize the import of their complaints and deflate their expectations. So he's wanting to have his cake and eat it too. Rather than simply basking in the glory of the victory and the praise showered on them 3 or 4 times a year, veterans actually vent their anger at the continuing failure of the government to deliver them benefits, at least to the level to which they feel entitled. Their claims of neglect are regularly covered in the newspapers, broadcast news, and internet news sources around every holiday associated with the war. Veterans regularly take their grievances to court to sue local, regional, or the national government, citing the various legal statutes guaranteeing them apartments and pensions in hopes that their suits will result in concrete action. In 2011, one veteran sent his medals back to Moscow to protest the government's failure to provide him adequate housing. The widespread clamoring for government benefits may be in part a factor in the perception of a growing lack of respect for elderly people in Russia. A poll taken in December 2013 revealed that 75% of those polled felt that old people were not respected in Russia. These old people constitute the war generation. The glorification of the war and veterans and the whining of the veterans about their entitlements has gotten to the point where it's begun to breed extreme cynicism, typically among young people. Lament after lament by veterans of the dwindling respect among youth for veterans and for the absence of knowledge of and gratitude for the glory of the victory fill the media. When a new memorial cemetery solely for veterans was opened in Moscow on June 22, 2013, a journalist described it sarcastically as a pet cemetery. This resulted in a predictable wave of indignant protests from veterans. Popular culture in the form of film does not always support the heroic version of the legacy Putin wants to convey. Some movies are out-and-out action thrillers in which the Red Army is clearly in the right and the Nazis are pure evil. But for the last 25 years or so, more often than not, screenwriters and directors are portraying the war as a far more complex event with a myriad of characters that do not fit neatly into the former narrative of all soldiers as heroes and the population as long-suffering but unfailingly patriotic. Issues of collaboration and the moral dilemmas faced by Soviet citizens under occupation, cowardice, and the continuing repression by the NKVD during the war, as well as the sometimes ambivalent nature of what constitutes patriotism and the enemy, leave the viewer uncertain as to who or what was right or wrong, making it hard to embrace the war as an absolute anchor of identity for the contemporary Russian. Putin's attempt to highlight the unity, suffering, and glory of Russia in World War II has to compete not only with all the entertainment provided by popular culture, but with calls to honor veterans and the memory of other wars. Afghan veterans want to be acknowledged as patriots who did their duty. Similarly, veterans of the Chechen wars lobby for similar social guarantees allotted to World War II veterans. Putin, reflecting national sentiment, seems conflicted and has been inconsistent in his placement of Stalin in the legacy of the war. At times he has been soft on Stalin, portraying him as a unifying figure for the nation, but more recently he prefers not to mention him or the Communist Party or the USSR when speaking of the war, after having denounced him in 2010 for the Katyn murders. This has caused a backlash from the Communist Party, which insists on crediting all three for victory. Others, particularly victims of Stalinist repression, object to sanitizing Soviet history by writing Stalin out and want to claim that the victory was won in spite of him. But for Putin, using the war to rally the people around a new Russian national identity, Stalin and his crimes are a troublesome complication. It is also a problem that a considerable number of people still see Stalin in a positive light regarding his role as commander-in-chief during the Great Patriotic War. A poll conducted in 2005 revealed that only 11% of respondents viewed Stalin's role in the war in a negative light, while 58% believed he made a major contribution to the victory. Putin also has to contend with competing interpretations of the legacy of the war. The Russian Orthodox Church gives God, the faith of the Russian people, and itself credit for the victory. Inferring that the enemies of the church were both Nazis and communists, one newspaper article claimed in 2006 that, quote, Russia obtained the victory by prayers, and the lives that the country sacrificed during fighting and in the rear areas were necessary for establishing the truth of God in the country and for the regeneration of people's souls, end quote. This is a direct challenge to the line pushed by the Russian right and supported by Putin, which praises Russian patriotism and loyalty to the state. Also troublesome are Russia's monarchists, who have their own political party for faith in fatherland. They want to formally rehabilitate General Vlasov, who was recruited out of a German POW camp in 1943 to form the anti-Soviet Russian Army of Liberation with volunteers from amongst Russian POWs. He was convicted of treason and hanged in 1946. Then there's outright rejection of the legacy by the radical right in Russian society. Russia has a National Socialist Party which uses semi-Nazi insignia for its symbol. The fringe right, represented by the National State Party of Russia, espouses racist nationalist policies. Skinheads wearing Nazi regalia and insignia march through the streets and brutalize national minorities and foreigners alike with relative impunity. There are also those who protest Putin's current policy in the Crimea and Ukraine by incorporating a rejection of his use of the legacy of World War II to promote patriotism. On September 2nd, 2014, a protester in St. Petersburg, dressed in the colors of the Russian flag and tied her wrists with George ribbons, a popular symbol of the victory. With her hands painted red as with blood and blindfolded, she cried out against Russian aggression in Ukraine. Most troubling for Putin and the Russian right is the rejection of the Russian version of the legacy of the war by the now free states of the former USSR. The legacy of the war, the Russians' attempt to impose their interpretation of it on others, and Putin's interest in destabilizing Eastern Europe has created international tensions with the former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all of which want to use their own interpretation to create anti-Russian national identities. In these states, pro-German veterans of the war who fought against the Soviets are celebrated. In accepting the Kremlin's invitation to attend the 2005 Victory Day celebration in Moscow, Latvia's president, Vara Vike-Freiberg, said, quote, May 9th is not only the day of victory over fascism, it also represents the loss of independence for all three Baltic states. We have to show the world the other side of this date, end quote. As part of creating new national identities, the Baltic states are rejecting all things Russian and Soviet. In rewriting their histories, people who resisted the Soviets are now made heroes, even if they supported some of the most heinous crimes of the Nazis under occupation. Baltic veterans of the war who fought for the Germans against the Russians have begun to organize and seek public recognition for their anti-communist, anti-Soviet, hence anti-Russian sacrifices. In many cases, these veterans are given positive acknowledgement by their governments. This has led to tension with Putin's Russia. Both galling and troublesome for Putin is that Europe in general is rejecting the aspect of the legacy that justifies Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, which calls into question the idea that contemporary Russia has any right to dominate these areas. On July 3rd, 2009, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, approved the Vilnius Declaration, which states that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, on the basis of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, were equally guilty of unleashing the Second World War. It further endorsed designating August 23rd, the day the pact was signed, as a day of remembrance for the victims of Nazism and Stalinism, which the Baltic states have already been celebrating. Lithuania subsequently adopted a law in 2008 to ban both Nazi and Soviet insignia as symbols of oppression. By equating Nazism with communism, the Red Army with the German Army, and Nazi conquest with Soviet liberation, Estonia and Latvia, along with all of Eastern Europe, supported by the OSCE, challenged the legacy of the Great Patriotic War as having freed them from totalitarian rule. They therefore feel no debt to Russia today. Ukraine has begun the process of revising the Russian version of World War II by issuing new textbooks and have eliminated the term the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union and replaced it simply with Second World War. The textbooks include positive coverage of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. It describes them as fighters for Ukrainian freedom against the Soviet reimposition of power after the German withdrawal. Georgia and Uzbekistan also have been in the process of de-Sovietizing themselves for years, renaming towns and removing Soviet-era monuments, including those memorializing the Great Patriotic War. Those that the government has yet to remove have been subjected to vandalism. Between 2009 and the present, at least half a dozen legislative measures have been introduced into Russia's State Duma to criminalize the defamation of the state's heroic version of the war. Suggested punishments range from fines, deportation, and up to 5 years in prison. So far, none have passed into law. Every attempt to pass such laws erupts into a storm of protest, which highlights opposing viewpoints, exactly what Putin does not want. Nevertheless, as acts of defiance, groups inside Russia, such as the anti-Stalinist Memorial, continue to print ugly and complicated truths about the war that challenge Putin's version, and indeed give strength to the views of the victims repressed by Stalin at home and abroad. For example, a Memorial published an article on the 75th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in which it labeled the pact criminal and immoral for enabling the arrest and deportation of massive numbers of people from the Baltic states. Russian liberals insist on seeing the magnitude of the losses, not as making the victory more glorious, but the Stalinist government more guilty. Rather than heroes, they cast the soldiers and suffering society as victims. In conclusion, the government's attempt to define the legacy as one supportive of unity, shared sacrifice, and patriotic valor is undermined by widespread ignorance of the history of the war and freedom of speech and the press, which enables conflicting interpretations of the legacy. In the information age, people have so many options for information and entertainment that there is a lot of competition for their attention. There are so many different political parties that no single interpretation of the Great Patriotic War legacy can satisfy everyone, or even the majority. In some ways, the attempts to keep the legacy alive is a handicap, especially in the area of finance and public confidence in the state's ability or willingness to fulfill its promises to veterans. The Great Patriotic War once stood alone as the anchor point of patriotism, but now there is competition on the political right in the form of skinheads adopting Nazi wardrobe, symbol and slogans, openly expressed anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiments with Nazi racial undertones, and the National Socialist political movement. On the left, the legacy is challenged by pro-democracy, anti-communist, anti-Stalinist, anti-Putin liberals. Even the Russian Orthodox Church has its own take on the legacy. The legacy is challenged from abroad, with Europe and the Baltic states equating the Nazis and Soviets as equals in oppression. And the post-Soviet generation of Russians is simply not invested in the legacy of the war, and their parents are wearied by it. In sum, Putin is failing in his efforts to use the legacy of the war as a unifying shibboleth for today's Russia.
We have so much on the table that I'd like to start questions right away.
That's really interesting.
While folks are thinking about their questions, let me just pose one to start with. I think we've heard from all three of you today a fairly pessimistic view about the future of Russia. Demographically, in terms of health and education, in terms of efforts by the government to recreate a sense of patriotism, of Russian patriotism, and of the economic basis of the state, particularly at a time when oil and gas prices are in decline. So why should we worry about Russia? It seems like if there's a threat from Russia, it's going to take care of itself. Nick, do you want to start on that?
Sure. Yeah, as I say, I'm not a demography as destiny boy, and I don't believe in historical determinism or historical materialism, because there are real actors in the world stage who can make decisions and have human agency. I'm not a strategist, but if I look at my homework and I try to pair it with some of the other things I read, I can make sense of it by seeing a very ambitious ruling circle in the Kremlin that is attempting to deal with this human resource and demographic decline by acting in a more risk-taking behavior in the international arena. And to some degree, this may be able to stabilize some construction of Russian international power for a while. But I don't think that that is a sustainable approach. As Russia's, in my interpretation, as Russia's human resource base erodes, the degree of risk-taking, aggressive international behavior necessary to counterbalance increases, and at some point we get to a very unpleasant disjuncture in this interpretation.
We have a situation in which a small group of people monopolize power and property in Russia and are determined to hold on to those perquisites and, in fact, are determined to rule for life. A situation like that can only degrade. It can only lead to more restiveness on the part of the population, more corruption, more lawlessness. We saw what happened in Ukraine. Under these circumstances, combined with the fact that the international situation, and in particular the price of oil, is no longer favorable for Russia, there's a danger that the Russian government will soon be faced with some form of internal unrest. It has very little it has very few tools for handling that internal unrest because there are no democratic institutions that can channel it and can give it lawful expression. It either has to be suppressed or it has to be met with concessions that will further destabilize the regime. So what we have is a situation in which the question of whether we should worry about Russia cannot be viewed as solely in terms of international relations. We should be worried about Russia, not necessarily because it's a strong country that presents a threat to the U.S. or to other Western countries, but rather because it represents a threat to itself, because the system is so dysfunctional. And if that internal threat becomes sufficiently severe, there could be very dangerous unrest in a country which is the world's second nuclear power.
Roger?
I agree completely. And if you notice, listen to NPR or watch the news, that Russia Putin, since day one, has not offered Russia a vision. He's always looking back to justify things. That he has no vision to offer other than, well, for his small group of leaders to maintain their own power. And that leads to, as Nick was saying, the potential for short-term risky behavior, as we see in the Crimea and eastern Ukraine, that is not war-gamed out thoroughly of what the unintended consequences might be. I think you look at any regime that relies heavily on looking backwards at a history, you look closely at them and you say the leadership has no vision for the future and is only reactive and trying to make it through the next day, the next week, and that's a very destabilizing situation, both domestically and for foreign policy.
If I could just ask the questioners to introduce themselves to the panel before they ask their question.
Yeah, it's fundamentally a restorationist. They always have short.
My name is Alexei Ilyin, Bush School of Government and Public Service. So I would like to ask a couple questions to Professor Reese and Mr. Seller. So as far as I understood, Professor Reese, you based your research on several polls of about 1,000 young people, probably some college undergrads that didn't do their homework on history class. And so you make a conclusion that Russian people do not remember the Second World War. By the way, Second World War is not the same as the Great Patriotic War. Great Patriotic War is considered part of the Second World War, war between Germany and the Soviet Union. So we do not make it same, we know that. But I lived most of my life in Russia, and I know that every family has some people that suffered losses in that war, and we remember that. If some young people do not know very well history, it's the problem of education. It's not a problem of national identity or people not having any feelings about the war. What I would like to ask you, is it so bad that the country is based on its national identity on the past, on some events of the past? Because I know that the United States is also celebrating many historical events. At the same time, some American people being not very aware about these events. How many people can explain the timeline of the Independence War? How many people can explain American participation in the Second World War? How many people can point Iraq or Afghanistan on the map? I think there are many people who cannot do that. At the same time, United States citizens celebrated very broadly.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I asked you, is it really bad for the country to make it identity based on the past?
I think it's bad for a country leadership not to offer a vision of the future. Here in Texas, we all remember the Alamo. Okay? Nobody wants to use that in our foreign relations with Mexico. Nobody wants to use Texas independence, the 10 years that Texas was an independent state, as a cause to rally against the rest of the United States. Okay? That's why Putin's attempt to use the legacy of World War II is an abuse of history, and a very ineffective one. That I stand by my words that the younger generation in Russia, and you're an exception, you would have been one of the 18% who could answer these questions quite correctly. It's not meaningful. It's not real. It wasn't real to Russia's myth Earth. There are bigger issues that they focus on that divide the country. Then they don't get together and say, no matter what's going on, well, at least we had the great victory. We can all agree on that, and we can stop, hold hands, and rally for a better Russia. That doesn't happen. It's not going to happen. That's what Putin wants to happen. Okay? Of course, there's a memory of the war, but is it meaningful? Can it be instrumentalized the way Putin wants to? No, it can't be. In every country's population, popular culture will always triumph over academics. Real understanding of history, understanding of the varieties of interpretation, and what they might mean for policymakers or for patriotism or unity. Okay? That's a given. Okay? And Putin wants it to be different, and it's not. So.
Another one?
Yes, I also have a question for Mr. Seder. First of all, I would like to make a remark about Mr. Khodorkovsky. In the Western press, Khodorkovsky is usually portrayed as some kind of saint among other gangsters, as he rightfully described the Russian oligarchs during the 90s. So all the oligarchs are gangsters, but Khodorkovsky is for some reason a saint. I don't understand that. I would like to point out some fact that usually the Western media ignores, that Khodorkovsky was guilty of several assassinations, including the mayor of the city of Neftejugansk in 1998. Actually, the assassination was done on the day of Khodorkovsky's birthday as a kind of present. The reason was that mayor accused Khodorkovsky of not paying taxes to the city's coffers, and Khodorkovsky just decided to remove him. There were other crimes. The problem with him is that Khodorkovsky went to jail not for these crimes, but for being inobedient to Russian President Putin. That's the problem of law being applied incorrectly. And the question is, another question, that you described the Chechen War as a series of atrocities by the Russian army. I would like to say that it didn't start with the terrorist attacks on apartment blocks. It started with terrorists from Chechnya invading Dagestan, the Republic of Dagestan, a neighboring region, in 1999. And of course, Russian military and Russian leadership had to reply on that attack. Besides, before that, in Chechnya, there was a series of crimes about 30,000 Russians were victims of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Oil was plundered from the pipelines. Thousands of people were kidnapped and killed. All that was going on, and ended up with the Chechen warlords invading the neighboring region of Dagestan. So there could be no other response. At the same time, yes, there were a lot of civilian victims, probably thousands of them during the First and Second Wars, but that is war. Collateral damage is inevitable. Why does the Western media still speak about these so-called atrocities of the Russian army in Chechnya, but turn a blind eye to the killings of civilian population that are done by the Ukrainian army in the east nowadays?
Well, you've
Please, let's let the...
Well, there you've touched on many things, so I'll try to. First of all, regarding Mikhail Khodorkovsky, you mentioned the murder of the mayor of Neftyugansk. This is very interesting, and for me, it's very personal because I went to Neftyugansk myself after the killing, and I went there on the assumption that, in fact, Yukos was behind it. That Yukos and therefore Khodorkovsky in one way or another was behind the killing of Petukhov, who was the mayor of Neftyugansk. But as I investigated it, and I began to gather information, and I wrote about this in my book, Darkness at Dawn, it was obvious to me that despite the public protests of Petukhov against the actions of Yukos, that in fact he cooperated with Yukos very well. And I talked to the police there and the local investigators, and they told me that that they don't have evidence that Yukos was responsible, and in fact that they believe that it was a dispute over the local market. Now, in my book, I had to decide what to say exactly because, in fact, all the information that I had gathered before I went to Neftyugansk seemed to point to the idea that Yukos, this big oil company, was going into this town. The mayor of the town was resisting the oil company, and the oil company just had him eliminated. But the facts that I found did not back that up, even though I found a lot of bad things about Yukos, but not murder. And that's what I wrote. In terms of your general point about Khodorkovsky being no better than the other oligarchs during the 1990s, you're completely correct. He wasn't any better. But it wasn't because of what he did wrong that he was arrested. Actually, he was arrested for what he did right. Because in the 2000s, he began to take the Yukos oil company and to turn it into a modern Western company, transparent, subjecting itself to Western accounting practices, well-run. And in fact, Khodorkovsky, for all of his faults, did a lot to improve the efficiency of oil production in Russia. And therefore, his arrest was wrong. And it was a case of, at the very least, of selective prosecution. In effect, prosecuting a political opponent for crimes that you were ignoring when they were committed by everybody else, and at a time when, and in fact, they were committed at a time when there was no law, really, in Russia. Now, as far as just try to remember all the points that you raised, because you raised a number of things. That we talked about the Chechen War, the Second Chechen War, if I'm not wrong. Well, first of all, the Russian army is or should be a disciplined military organization that does not commit mass atrocities against civilians. And we hold them to that standard just as we hold our own army to that standard. The attack on Dagestan is very mysterious because there's evidence that, in fact, it was carried out with the connivance of the Russian authorities, specifically in order to create a pretext for a new war in Chechnya. The invasion of Dagestan is a whole complex subject. But the sequence of events, to me at least, resembles the following: that members of the Yeltsin entourage, in cooperation with Shamil Basayev, who was the leader of the Islamic extremists in Chechnya, organized this incursion in Dagestan, which mysteriously met with no Russian resistance. Even the column, when they withdrew from Dagestan, first of all, the border guards were removed before they entered, mysteriously, and there was no attack on the invading force, and they left without being attacked. But but once they had done so, there was bombing of the innocent civilians in the usual Russian fashion. The important point here is that created a plausible chain of events, because the invasion of Dagestan, the Russian bombings in response to the invasion of Dagestan could then be seen as having triggered the apartment bombings. And therefore, people were very quick to believe that the apartment bombings took place in Moscow as revenge for the Russian reaction to the invasion of Dagestan. From my point of view, the whole thing was fabricated in order to give an excuse for a second Chechen war and to bring Putin to power. Now, I allow the possibility that I am incorrect about these events. But if I am, the evidence exists, and the Russian authorities can easily prove it. All they have to do is produce the bomb that was found in the basement of the apartment building in Ryazan and prove that it was made up of sugar and not of hexagon, a high explosive that's capable of blowing up an apartment building. They refuse to do that. Russian Constitution gives them no basis for hiding that kind of evidence. And until they are willing to disprove these allegations, then the overwhelming circumstantial evidence that backs them up needs to be treated as very persuasive.
Other questions? Round.
Hi, Eric Gomez, Bush School of Government and Public Service. I was wondering if you could speak to how Putin is engaging with China, because as we know, China is probably going to be the rising, one of the most important countries in the world for the 21st century, and how the Russian and Chinese connection works could shape a lot of both international politics and especially US policy towards both countries. So I was wondering if you see any sort of historical basis for the identity formation, or historical callings back to how they relate with China, or are they trying to, or is Russia trying to forge some kind of new path forward to create a more cooperative relationship?
I hope you're talking to him, because I don't know anything about Russia and China.
Well, I'll do my best. I'm not sure I know that much either. It's clear that if you look at the geopolitical situation, then Russia is a natural ally of the West, because only in alliance with the West can Russia hope to balance the growing power of China. And Russia is dwarfed in terms of its population by China, and it is certainly not as economically dynamic. But the Russian and Chinese leaders have a shared interest, because they're authoritarian leaders in both cases. And that shared interest is in resisting the demands and the pressure for human rights fulfillment that come from the West. And under those circumstances, with Russia finding its actions in Ukraine sanctioned by the West, it inevitably turns to China as one place that's not going to raise the issue of human rights, for one thing, and for another will provide them with economic relations that aren't subject to Western sanctions. So whether the historic distrust between the two countries can be overcome on that basis, which is purely tactical and based very much on the need of the regime in Russia to defend itself, something that I really am very skeptical about.
Jonathan Coopersmith, Department of History at Texas A&M. Just wondering if, this being the Bush School of Public Service, if you were advising the American president today about their Russian-European policy for, say, the next half decade, what concerns or themes would you emphasize?
I would start by the U.S. foreign policy since the collapse has been misguided in the fact that all administrations, day one to day now, have been projecting our values onto a completely different culture. We expect them to accept our way of thinking as though it's kind of a one-size-fits-all democracy for the world. It's the best thing ever, and they should just naturally gravitate towards that, and we can't quite figure out why that isn't happening. And I would advise the government to stop doing that. Treat Russia as a separate country with a separate history, a separate culture, a way of doing things that if we expect to get along with them and help them in the future, to really spend more time seeing things from their perspective, putting ourselves in their shoes and seeing what can be worked with and helped with within their framework that they can actually understand and not feel challenged, put upon, looked down upon for not seeing things our way.
I think that we're entering a very difficult period in U.S.-Russian relations, but we may be facing a period in which those relations are established on a more realistic basis. I don't think that the attitude toward Russia should be one of unrelenting hostility. But at the same time, what we're dealing with in the case of Russia is an alternative reality that's being foisted on people by a regime that's acting not in their defense, but in its own defense. So we have to, really the task of the outside world is to assert moral influence and to reassert those basic principles that are necessary not just for us, but for them. I think that there's a real danger of Russia heading for a systemic crisis. Under those circumstances, values that are not being adhered to today and messages that aren't being listened to may become very important in the future. And for that reason, I think it's extremely important to stand on principle regarding Russian aggression where it takes place, whether it's the seizure of Crimea, a senseless slaughter that's been inspired by Russia in eastern Ukraine, or in fact in terms of Russia's widespread corruption of the Western financial system and its use of the West to park illegally extracted money. All of these things are going to be important because Russia's a country that has had, generations of attacks on its moral foundations, and it's going to need all the support it can get in that respect if, as I fear, the situation becomes unstable there.
So, I mean, there's a tension here, right? I mean, the long-term threat that we get, I think, from the panel is that Russian weakness is a potential problem for the United States, for Europe, for the globe. But right now, we see a Russia perhaps compensating for that weakness by being rather aggressive, but aggressive within a zone of influence that historically has been Russian, right? Ukraine.
Well, it was part of the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, of course, and it was dominated from Moscow.
And part of the Russian Empire for.
And was part of the Russian Empire for centuries. Although it is a distinct culture and a distinct people. And there were parts of Ukraine that were not part of the Russian Empire. The Western Ukraine was part of the Austrian Empire, and then it was part of Poland. And Ukrainian nationalism is particularly strong in those parts of the country that do have a European heritage.
I guess I want to draw you both out a little bit more on this idea of we have to understand the weakness of Russia and understand that they have a different viewpoint, but we also have to stand up to Russian aggressiveness.
And we can't adopt their values, which in fact are what is dragging them down. We need to understand what they are, of course, and we have to understand what the problem is. But we can't get into a situation, as many people have a tendency to do, to start looking at the world through the same distorted lens that the Russian leaders are using, because they use that lens in their own interest, in part.
Hope you don't think I was suggesting that.
No, I don't. I don't at all. And I was just speaking just in general terms and for myself. But we need to, on the one hand, I think what you were saying, and which I profoundly agree, is that our policy in the U.S. oftentimes is, we look at Russian politicians as if they're, just like our politicians here. This was particularly, in the case of Yeltsin, it was the idea that, Yeltsin is the embodiment of democracy. President George W. Bush, when he first took office, said that he looked in Putin's eyes, thought he could take a measure of his soul. These are mistakes that American presidents make because they assume they can establish a personal relationship with a Russian leader. They are badly advised in many cases, and they don't realize just how different the outlook of their Russian interlocutors is. It takes bitter experience before they come around. Even President Obama's come around, by the way. He would not. I think that he would not make the same. I mean, I predict that he would not make the same. He would not repeat his remark that was caught on a live mic when he told Dmitry Medvedev that he was looking forward to working with Vladimir Putin in his next term. And that stirred some controversy at the time, because I guess he thought he wouldn't have to deal with the Republicans in Congress or some such thing. But I think that he's had a sobering experience. But this type of sobering experience is repeated time and time again. I've been covering Russia long enough to have seen many, many, many examples of this. I'll just quickly tell you one because it's anecdotal. That when I was just a young reporter starting out, I was working for the Financial Times. In 1979, there was the Brezhnev-Carter summit meeting, and Brezhnev said, whispered to Carter, "God will not forgive us if we fail." Carter was overcome with emotions and threw his arms around Brezhnev and kissed him, and that photo went around the world as proof of Carter's stupidity. And then 6 months later, the Soviet forces invades Afghanistan, and Carter gets on the phone on the hotline with his friend Brezhnev, and asks him what's going on. And Brezhnev says, "Well, the Russian forces are defending the Afghans from a foreign invasion." when in fact they were the foreign invasion. And Carter afterwards said, you know, I learned more in 3 minutes on the hotline with Brezhnev about communism than I had understood in my entire previous life. So these kind of, you know, presidents do wise up, and it does happen. It would be a shame. It's a shame that it often takes bitter experience, but that's the way it is.
Roger, do you want to play out some of these themes?
Well, yeah, I would like to highlight the fact that I stand by my comment that Putin and his administration, they don't have a vision, but they do have an agenda. And I think that's kind of the U.S. foreign policy has been slow on the uptake on identifying what the agenda is. And it's just been pointed out here, it's about them staying in power. And the country is just a vehicle for those people to stay in power and enrich themselves. And I think we've kind of been giving them more of the benefit of the doubt than they deserve as national leaders of a great nation. And we maybe should be giving them a little bit more personal attention as the corrupt thugs or oligarchs that they are, and treat them as though these are people with an agenda, and we need to deal with those people and their agenda rather than sort of state to state, if you know what I'm getting at.
Well, we had a lot of questions from that side. How about over on this side? Ambassador Napper.
Hi, Larry Napper from the Bush School. I wonder, this panel is about Russia, but it's hard to talk about Russia in the current circumstances without thinking a little bit about Ukraine,
Yeah.
and its predicament and its problems. And I wonder whether you have any sense of somewhat of any greater optimism after the recent elections in Kiev as to whether we could have in place a set of Ukrainian leaders who might be able to do something about the chronic problems of the country, somehow to put together an economic reform package, somehow to deal with corruption, somehow to try to overcome the divisive and dysfunctional politics that we've seen for the last couple of decades there.
Well, I have hope. I mean, if the U.S. is going to have any kind of leverage over Ukraine and them getting their house in order, this is the time that that's going to happen, when they have to listen because they need us so desperately, and we're actually finally primed to really help in a meaningful way. Whether that, and I think we have people on the ground trying to do that, how deep that will go and how long it will be sustained, that's, to me, is the big question. If that kind of pressure we can put on them to clean their house is sustained for the long term, and I'm talking very long term, you know, it takes to clean house and to get people's attitudes reoriented, it could take 10, 20 years, you know. But I think that process, we might be seeing that process started now.
I think, you know, Ukraine went through the same travail that Russia went through after the fall of communism, the same criminalization, the same massive corruption, and by the way, the same demographic catastrophe as in Russia. The countries are very similar in lots of ways, and if there may be really a golden lining in all this, if Ukraine really will now be oriented toward the West and can make the immense effort that's required to eliminate corruption, or at least bring it down to more manageable levels, it could be a great benefit not only for Ukraine but for Russia, because, as a positive example. This is one of the things that disturbed Russians about Georgia, was the fact that Georgia implemented very successful reforms and was doing very, very well. And Georgia was a former Soviet republic as well. They fear the impact of a positive example.
Other questions? I've got one while people are thinking about more. Let me try to channel Vladimir Putin for a second. Right? My country was in free fall collapse when I took over. Well, every chart we saw indicated that, and I've righted the ship. And you might not like my methods all the time, but I've righted the ship. And the charts indicate that our decline leveled off, and we might even be seeing a brighter future coming down the pike. So why shouldn't people in Russia like me? Why shouldn't I be popular? I've stabilized the situation. I've done away with the oligarchs, or at least I've got them under control. What's so bad about what I've done for Russia? What would Russia have looked like if Yeltsin and his cronies had continued on the path that they were on before I maneuvered him out of power?
This is just a game, right? So I can.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I am not Vladimir Putin.
Okay.
Yeah.
On the one hand, people really do give him credit for arresting the free fall, but in a perverse way that has caused him problems, because now they expect things to actually rapidly improve. That the methods for reversing the free fall are actually not the methods for recovery and advancing. I mean, I think that's kind of the bottom line, is people understood, okay, those things were necessary. Now we're back to square one. Stop using those methods that got us here, and let's get methods that will take us to square 2, 3, and 4, up to 10. So expectations are rising, particularly among urban middle-class people with potential to do better, and the system that he has stabilized is not a system that's going to give a lot of opportunity for those people to honestly apply their intelligence and hard work to get ahead. And they still see, you know, as Miss Russia, I mean, Miss Earth, Russia's Miss Earth was saying, it's still gnawing at the vast majority of the people that this unfairness still exists, that the oligarchs, the ultra-wealthy are selling Russia out at the expense of the common people. And maybe it's not as bad as it was. It's definitely not as bad as it was, but they're not ready to accept the level that it still is at. And they don't see any change in that level at this point, that's going to, basically it looks like that's going to continue. And so the expectations have increased, but the ability to match them, or the desire to match them, doesn't seem to be there. So that would still be cause for discontent with Putin, I think.
It's worth pointing out that the economic recovery began a year before Putin took power. It was actually the default and of September 1998, default and devaluation, which was a massive shock to the Russian economy, but it had the effect of making the country much more competitive, plus the fact that the market institutions that were created with so much, at such a high cost, began to function. And most important of all, of course, the price of oil and other raw materials began to climb. Russia was the world's leading beneficiary of the boom in raw materials prices in the 2000s. Now, the Putin leadership did do certain things right, no question about it. They introduced a flat tax for income tax that resulted in much more in the way of income of revenue being collected. There were other things that they began to do. Many laws that had been prepared actually under Yeltsin were finally implemented, and government institutions began to be rebuilt and to be staffed, even staffed with competent people to a certain extent. But the point is that, and then the boom gained traction. And Putin got the credit. How much of the credit he really deserved is an open question. But the one thing to bear in mind is that the distinction that's sometimes made between Yeltsin and Putin is a completely artificial one. I mean, Putin was Yeltsin's hand-picked successor, and he was picked specifically in order to protect the ill-gotten gains of the oligarchs of the 1990s. The fact that the situation finally began to right itself has been credited to Putin, but the amount of credit that he really deserves is probably a great deal less than what he's gotten. And the important thing is that in the process, despite this huge inflow of money as a result of the sharp rise in the price of oil, gas, and other raw materials, nothing was done to take advantage of this bonanza. For example, it didn't result in the construction of any kind of serious infrastructure, and the lawlessness and corruption only got worse. So people understand in Russia that although there was an economic boom, and that just as in any country, even in our country, when people are living better, they support whichever ruler is in power, that nonetheless, in fundamental ways, their situation hasn't changed.
If there are no more questions, going once, going twice. Oh, here,
Well,
good.
Thank you, Susanna Spoisek, Bush School. I'm wondering, what role will ordinary Russian citizens play moving forward? Because we're talking of a very large number of people whose livelihoods are being directly affected. What do you expect their role to be from now on?
Is that a question more about
Politics
kind
or
of
economics? Or
well, politics, economics, in terms of voting behavior, in terms of democracy, or in terms of kind of mobilization from below, a la, uprisings? What?
More of the latter.
Kind of the uprisings. There we go.
well,
Russian spring coming.
yeah, I don't see it, but I see the desire for a Russian spring there. I mean, there are still sporadic people protesting in Russia today the aggression in Ukraine. That the Russian people are, I mean, certainly, it's like I mentioned before, they're fragmented. There's all different kinds of ideas. People who will support Putin to the bitter end, and there are people who've never liked him, and then everything in between, and it shifts. But the educated, urban, prosperous or potentially prosperous middle class does have its doubts. They do have aspirations for more political participation, for a fairer system, for rule of law, things that will really underpin success. Armed uprising, I don't see that ever happening. It's just not that bad, and not that many arms to be had. And I think people want reform rather than revolution. But I think there's a great deal of, I don't want to say pessimism or realism, in Russia is kind of the same thing, about imminent change, hope. But there's always hope, and there'll always be that strata that's going to try to push in as much as they can safely, get the word out. But he's not going to get a free ride in the meantime. And as long as the ideas are there and being spoken, they might get more traction under certain circumstances. It's hard to say. But they're not going to be passive. They're not going to be silent. There will be constant push for better, politically and socially and economically and demographically.
I think that the situation is very unpredictable. Nobody could have predicted on the eve of the massive demonstrations in Ukraine that the country would rise up the way it did. And it's very possible that if the police had not beaten, the riot police had not beaten the group of students who were camped out around in the Christmas tree in the Maidan Square, that the whole anti-criminal revolution in Ukraine might not have happened. It was kind of the spark that coming in the wake of Yanukovych's refusal to pursue an association agreement for Ukraine with the European Union, mobilized people to come to the square and to protest and to take matters really into their own hands. Now, there was a case in Russia. A mother and her daughter were in their car, and a car driven by an executive of Lukoil, one of the big oil companies, jumped the traffic and hit them head on, and they were both killed. And then the authorities blamed the accident on the mother and daughter. They were both obstetricians, And the internet exploded with protests. This was in 2010 in Russia. But there were no public demonstrations. But incidents like that are endemic to the kind of society that Russia is. And no one knows under changed circumstances whether the next such incident might not provoke something similar to what happened in Ukraine, especially if Russians are experiencing drastic pressure on their standard of living and are getting fed up with the lawlessness of a regime that wants to rule forever. So I think that we haven't heard the last from the Russian population, and that they could well play an important political role in the future.
There's been color revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine,
Kyrgyzstan.
I'm not too good on this. Any other places in the FSU? What's different about Russia? You both seem to say that there's not that much different about Russia. Are the security services different? Are they more loyal? Are they more organized? Is opposition or tendencies of opposition more dispersed, less united, more divided among themselves on ideological bases? Or is there something that at least so far has made Russia immune from these kinds of uprisings that other places in the former Soviet Union that had, very similar, in many ways, very similar histories in the Soviet period experienced? Or is it just that oil prices were so high that in the 2000s?
Russia, there was a lot of prosperity in Russia for a long time, but we saw that in 2011, demonstrators did come out, and they came out in quite large numbers. We've witnessed the events in Hong Kong. The point is that everything can seem completely passive and calm, and then suddenly something changes. The basic conditions for mass protests really do exist. People in Russia have experienced the corruption and the lawlessness. It takes a spark. I mean, will there be such a spark in the near future? Hard to say. We don't know. But we do know that Russia has provoked the whole world by seizing part of a neighboring country and fomenting a civil war. That it has done so in the hope that it can do these things with impunity. Whether it can or not remains to be seen. It's equally possible that they've set in motion a process that ultimately they can't control. After all, this happened before with the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, just to point out that it was hoped that this would be a short, victorious war, and it led to the 1905 revolution, which in effect ultimately ended the Tsarist regime.
Roger?
Yeah, I completely agree that everything's unpredictable. But looking back at the history of the 1905 revolution, 1917 revolutions, there were always organized groups trying to push revolution, violent change. So there were a lot of matches being struck. Mm-hmm. The wind kind of blew them out a lot, but there were always people striking matches. I'm just not, and not that that's actually necessary, because I mean, China with Tiananmen Square, that just happened like that. But I don't see that in Russia right now. I mean, the FSB is not going to let that happen, I think. So I think it will take something really dramatic, but you never know what that will be. It could be something as simple as a car accident and a government cover-up. For that could be the last straw. You just don't know. But
if there are no more questions, I'd like you to join me in thanking the panel for a very stimulating morning.
Thank you very much. We now have a break before lunch. Lunch is served at 12:30 next door. 12? We moved it up. Okay, 12 o'clock for lunch next door. You're all invited. And then the second panel starts at 2:30 this afternoon. Thank you very much. I didn't mention this morning that this conference is also co-sponsored by the Glasscock Center and by the History Department. I should have said that this morning. Thank you.